It all began on a warm summer morning, the kind of morning that should have been peaceful. The sun was climbing above the horizon, painting streaks of orange across the sky, and the hum of cicadas was just starting to fill the air. My land stretched out wide and open, acres of rolling green pasture and a small line of trees along the property edge. For years this land had been mine, hard-earned, carefully maintained, and a source of both pride and peace. But peace has a way of attracting people who think they can take advantage of it. And that's when she showed up. At first I thought nothing of the new neighbor who had moved in just down the road. She was polite enough during the first wave of introductions, flashing a smile that seemed a little too perfect and a tone that carried a hint of superiority. People around town called her Karen, not necessarily behind her back, but often enough that it became her unofficial title. I quickly learned why. Karen believed everything revolved around her. She treated the local HOA like her personal army, weaponizing their petty rules to intimidate others. She thrived on control, and the more power she thought she had, the more reckless she became. My land, unfortunately, became her latest obsession. It started with small remarks, casual comments about how wasted my open fields were, how she could beautify them if they were hers, how it was unfair for one person to own so much land when she could do so much with it. I brushed it off at first, thinking it was harmless chatter. But deep down, something told me it wasn't going to stop there. A week later, I found survey stakes on my property line, bright orange markers driven into the ground, the kind surveyors use when someone is plotting new boundaries. My stomach dropped when I saw them. These stakes weren't mine. Nobody had any business putting them there. That's when I realized Karen wasn't just talking. She was planning. By the next day, she was walking the edge of my property with a clipboard, acting as though she were some kind of official. When I asked what she was doing, she brushed me off, claiming she had documentation that suggested part of my land actually belonged to her. It was a bold lie, but boldness was her weapon of choice. For weeks, she pushed harder. She filed complaints with the HOA about my fencing, about the supposed unkept look of my land, even about the noise of my tractor. Every time she tried to chip away at my patience. Every time I reminded myself that my deeds and titles were in order and my land wasn't going anywhere. But Karen wasn't the kind of person who gave up easily. The turning point came one late afternoon. I was walking along the northern boundary when I noticed something that made my blood boil. Karen had moved part of her garden fence onto my land. It wasn't much, just a few feet, but it was deliberate. It was her way of saying, I can take what I want and you can't stop me. And in that moment I knew this wasn't going to be a small dispute. This was war. I spent that night combing through my records, every survey map, every deed, every boundary marker I could find. I wanted proof, undeniable proof, because if Karen wanted to play games, I was going to play smarter. I wasn't about to lose a single inch of what I had worked so hard to own. But little did I know, Karen was already one step ahead. She wasn't just trying to steal land. She was trying to drag me into a fight so big, it would shake the entire neighborhood, and the first real battle was about to begin. The morning after I discovered Karen's fence creeping onto my property, the air felt heavier. There was no denying it anymore. This wasn't an accident, this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a deliberate move. Karen had made her intentions clear, and the battle lines had been drawn. What struck me most was the arrogance of it all. Her fence posts weren't subtle. They jutted out into my field as if they had always belonged there, as if the land had been hers all along. She acted like she could rewrite history just by hammering a few posts into the ground. I stood there staring at them, anger boiling inside me. This land wasn't just dirt and grass, it was years of work, sacrifice, and investment. Every corner of it had a story, and every acre had been paid for in full. Karen wasn't only trying to take land, she was trying to take part of my life. By noon, I saw her in her yard, casually sipping coffee while admiring her so-called expanded garden. She knew exactly what she was doing. And when our eyes met, she didn't look away. She smirked. That smirk told me everything. It told me she thought she had already won, but she was wrong. I started with documentation. I made copies of every deed, every legal boundary survey, and even old photographs that showed the land before her house was even built. I wasn't going to let her gaslight me into doubting what I knew was true. If she wanted a fight, I was going to come armed with facts. That night, though, Karen struck again. Under the cover of darkness, she extended her encroachment. The next morning, I woke to find that more fencing had been pushed farther onto my property. It wasn't just a few feet now, it was nearly 10. And alongside it, she had planted shrubs as if to claim the land permanently. This wasn't just arrogance anymore. This was aggression. I contacted the HOA, hoping they'd see reason. But instead of siding with the facts, they sided with her. Karen had allies. She had spent months charming the board, convincing them she was their golden member. She spun stories about how I was neglectful, how I was wasting land, how her beautification project was actually for the good of the community. And to my disbelief, the HOA bought it. They called me in for a hearing, accusing me of being uncooperative and hostile. Hostile for defending my own land. That was when I realized Karen's plan was bigger than I thought. She wasn't just encroaching physically, she was encroaching politically. She wanted to use the HOA as her weapon, to paint me as the villain, so that by the time the dust settled, everyone would see her as the rightful owner of land that had never been hers. But I wasn't about to let that happen. I started documenting everything. Photos, videos, timestamps. Every inch she moved onto my land became part of a growing file. I even brought in a professional surveyor to mark the official property line with glaring fluorescent stakes. There was no mistaking it. The line was clear and she was clearly trespassing. Still, Karen didn't stop. She doubled down. Within days, she hosted a garden party, inviting neighbors to admire her new expansion. People walked across my land, wine glasses in hand, laughing and chatting as if they belonged there. And there she was in the center, holding court like a queen, boasting about her vision for the neighborhood. Standing at a distance, I watched in silence, fury burning inside me. She wasn't just stealing land, she was stealing respect. She was stealing the perception of ownership, turning people against me, rewriting the truth in real time. That night, as the party lights dimmed and the laughter faded, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let Karen write the story of my land. I was going to write it myself. And if she thought this was going to be easy, she had no idea who she was dealing with. The next chapter of this war was about to begin. And this time I wouldn't just defend, I would fight back. The weeks that followed were a blur of tension and preparation. Karen's fence stood tall and defiant on my property, her shrubs sinking their roots deeper into my soil. Every day I walked the boundary line, documenting her encroachment, each photo and video another piece of evidence for the case I knew I would have to fight. But Karen was already several steps ahead. She had filed an official complaint with the HOA, accusing me of harassment, neglect, and obstructing community improvements. Her words dripped with manipulation, carefully crafted to paint me as an enemy of progress. By the time the notice of a hearing arrived in my mailbox, it was clear. Karen wanted to drag me into the public square and humiliate me. The day of the hearing arrived under a sky heavy with gray clouds, as if the weather itself understood what was about to happen. The HOA board gathered in their small meeting hall, a place that had once been meant for community, now turned into a courtroom where neighbors judge neighbors. Karen sat at the front, dressed to impress, her stack of papers neatly arranged, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. She greeted people warmly as they filed in, shaking hands, exchanging small talk, pulling strings. She was weaving her web and the board members were already tangled in it. When my turn came to speak, I laid out my case. I showed the deeds, the surveys, the photographs that left no doubt where the property line stood. I explained how Karen's fence and shrubs were trespassing, how her actions were deliberate. Every word was steady, measured, undeniable, but as I spoke, I could feel the weight of the room pressing against me. The board members nodded politely, but their eyes flicked toward Karen, waiting for her reaction as if she were the one truly in charge. And when she finally stood to speak, her performance was nothing short of masterful. She spoke with feigned innocence, her voice sweet, but laced with accusation. She painted herself as the victim, claiming she only wanted to improve the community, to create beauty where there was none. She described me as hostile, unreasonable, unwilling to compromise. She shed crocodile tears, dabbing her eyes with a tissue as she described the stress I was putting her through, and the room believed her. By the end of the hearing, the board issued their ruling not against her trespass but against me. They demanded I cooperate with Karen's expansion project and cease all harassment. They even threatened fines if I continued to resist. It felt like a betrayal, not just by the HOA, but by the very community I had lived beside for years. They had swallowed Karen's lies whole, blinded by her charm, deaf to the truth I had laid bare. But as I walked out of that meeting hall, one thing became clear. I could no longer rely on the HOA for justice. They weren't protectors of fairness. They were Karen's pawns. From that day forward, I knew this fight wasn't just about boundaries anymore. It was about control. It was about one woman's hunger for power and my refusal to be consumed by it. The storm had broken. And now I was done playing defense. I would find a way to turn the tables, because Karen had made one critical mistake. She thought I would give up. But what she didn't realize was that every attack only fueled me more, and soon, the battle she thought she was winning would take a turn she'd never see coming. After the HOA hearing, I walked away carrying more than just frustration. I carried resolve. Karen had won that round, yes, but her victory had been shallow. It was built on lies, manipulation, and charm, and lies have a way of collapsing when exposed to the truth. The more I thought about it, the more I realized Karen had overplayed her hand. By dragging the HOA into the fight, she had made the battle bigger. She had invited more eyes, more attention, and that meant more opportunities for her mask to slip. So I began planning. The first step was gathering allies, not the HOA, not the ones she had already poisoned against me, but neutral parties who dealt in facts, not gossip. I hired a licensed surveyor, someone with no ties to the neighborhood whose report would stand firm in any legal setting. He walked the entire property line, measured every angle, and drove fresh stakes deep into the soil. When he was finished, the conclusion was undeniable. My deeds were accurate, my boundaries were correct, and Karen's fence was trespassing by nearly 10 feet. This report was more than just paperwork. It was a weapon. The second step was documentation. Every time Karen hosted another party on my land, I filmed it. Every time she added another plant, another decoration, another claim, I took photos. Dates, times, and records piled up into a mountain of evidence too large to ignore. But evidence alone wasn't enough. Karen thrived on perception. She had convinced the HOA that she was a hero, a community builder. If I wanted to win, I had to shatter that image. So I waited. One Saturday afternoon, she hosted yet another gathering, complete with tables, string lights, and loud music echoing across the neighborhood. Cars lined the street. Guests wandered freely across the stolen strip of land, wine glasses in hand, treating it like her personal park. But this time, I was ready. I had already contacted the county zoning office and local code enforcement. When the officials arrived, they found more than just trespass. They found unpermitted construction, unlicensed events, and safety violations scattered across her so-called expansion. Her fence wasn't up to code. Her parties exceeded noise ordinances. Her encroachments violated every local property law on the books. Karen's smile faltered that day. For the first time, she wasn't in control. As the officials questioned her, took notes, and issued warnings, I stood at a distance and watched. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was the first crack in her armor. Word spread quickly after that. Neighbors who once admired her garden began whispering about fines and violations. Some started to question whether her beautification project was as noble as she claimed. The perfect image she had built was starting to crumble, piece by piece, and that was only the beginning. Behind the scenes, I was preparing for the final move: legal action. With the surveyor's report in hand, with the mountain of documentation I had gathered, I was building an airtight case. Karen thought the HOA's ruling had ended things. What she didn't realize was that the HOA had no true power against the law. For every inch she stole, I now had the means to take back tenfold. But Karen wasn't done yet. She fought harder, doubling her efforts trying to rally her supporters. She accused me of harassment once again, accused me of conspiring against her, accused me of being the reason the community was falling apart. She grew desperate, and desperation made her reckless. That recklessness was going to be her downfall, because while she was busy spinning lies, I was preparing the truth. And the truth, once unleashed, would not only protect my land, it would destroy the empire of control she had built over the neighborhood. The balance was shifting. For the first time, Karen wasn't ahead, and soon she would learn a lesson she would never forget. The storm had been building for months, and by the time autumn rolled in, the battle lines were clear. Karen had her allies in the HOA, her false image of a community savior, and her stubborn refusal to back down. I had my surveyor's report, my mountain of evidence, and the truth on my side. It was only a matter of time before the clash left the neighborhood stage and entered a real courtroom. Filing the lawsuit was a decisive step. It wasn't just about reclaiming the stolen strip of land anymore. It was about setting the record straight. Property boundaries are not suggestions. They are law. And if Karen wanted to test that, she was about to learn just how serious it could become. The moment she was served the papers, the facade cracked. That smirk she once wore so proudly was gone. Neighbors who once watched her with admiration now whispered about her legal troubles. The fines from code enforcement had already rattled her, but now the weight of an actual lawsuit pressed down on her like a storm cloud she couldn't escape. Her retaliation was immediate. She tried to rally the HOA against me again, calling emergency meetings, distributing letters filled with half-truths and accusations. She painted me as vindictive, claiming I was using the legal system to bully her. But the more she shouted, the more people began to see her desperation for what it was. The day of the first hearing arrived. The courtroom was quiet, formal, and stripped of the theatrics Karen usually relied on. There were no wine glasses, no laughing guests, no HOA board nodding in her favor. There was only evidence, testimony, and the law. I presented the surveyor's report first, an expert, licensed, and undeniable account of the property line. Then came the photographs, each one stamped with dates and times, showing her fence, her shrubs, her trespassing parties. Finally, I presented the documentation of fines and warnings from county officials. Piece by piece, the story came together. Not a story of beautification, but of entitlement. Not a story of community, but of control. Karen, for once, struggled to keep her composure. She argued, she objected, she twisted words, but each time, the judge cut through the performance. Here, her charm meant nothing. Here, the truth mattered. By the end of the day, the ruling was clear. The land was mine. Karen's fence was to be removed immediately, her encroachments dismantled, and her continued trespassing fined heavily if it continued. The HOA, powerless outside its petty fines, had no say in the matter. The law had spoken, it should have ended there. But Karen was not one to surrender gracefully. Within days of the ruling, she tried one last desperate move. She gathered her supporters and staged what she called a community reclamation project, claiming the court had been unfair, that the system was broken, and that the neighborhood needed to stand together against me. She was rallying for one final show of power, and that was when I realized Karen wasn't fighting for land anymore. She was fighting to save her pride. The showdown wasn't just legal, it was personal. So I prepared for the final confrontation. With cameras set, documents ready, and every legal safeguard in place, I waited. I knew Karen would come. I knew she couldn't resist making one last move. And when she did, the whole neighborhood would be watching. The lesson she had tried so hard to avoid was about to hit her harder than she could ever imagine. The final act of Karen's campaign began on a cold, brittle morning. I woke to the sound of voices, laughter, and the clatter of tools. When I looked out across the property line, I saw exactly what I had expected. Karen and a small group of loyal neighbors armed with shovels and garden tools, marching onto my land like it already belonged to them. She had called it a community reclamation project, but the reality was plain. It was trespass, bold and undeniable. Her fence had already been ordered down by the court, but there she was again, hammering new posts into the soil, planting new shrubs, her face flushed with stubborn determination. This was her last stand. What Karen didn't know was that I had anticipated this. Days earlier, I had installed cameras to capture every angle of the property line. I had notified the sheriff's office of the court ruling, providing them with the official documents and surveyor's report. All I had to do was wait. As Karen pushed deeper into my land, staging her so-called project, I placed the call. Within minutes, the flashing lights of patrol cars appeared at the end of the road. The sight alone was enough to send murmurs of panic through her little crowd. The deputies stepped out, firm and direct. They had copies of the court order in hand. Karen's arguments, her excuses, her theatrics, none of it mattered now. The law was no longer a gray area, no longer up for debate. The line was drawn, literally and legally. One by one, the neighbors who had joined her began to scatter, unwilling to risk fines or charges for her ego. Karen, however, refused to move. She stood by her fence post, gripping it tightly, her face twisted with defiance. But when the deputies made it clear that her actions now qualified as contempt of court, the fight drained from her. The fence was pulled down. The shrubs were uprooted. The soil was cleared. And for the first time in months, my land stood untouched, exactly as it was meant to be. The aftermath was swift and merciless. Karen was fined heavily for contempt. Her reputation in the neighborhood shattered. The HOA, once her greatest weapon, distanced themselves from her completely, embarrassed by how far they had been dragged into her schemes. Neighbors who once saw her as a leader now avoided her, whispering about her downfall. But the greatest punishment was not the fines, not the legal costs, not even the loss of face. The greatest punishment was her silence. The woman who once strutted around the neighborhood with arrogance and control now walked quietly, her head low, her influence gone. As for me, I returned to my land with a renewed sense of pride. Every inch of soil felt heavier with meaning. It wasn't just property anymore, it was proof. Proof that patience, preparation, and persistence could overcome even the loudest, most entitled opponent. Proof that truth, once armed with evidence, could silence lies, and most importantly, it was proof that no matter how much someone thinks they can take what isn't theirs, there are lines that cannot be crossed. Karen thought she could steal my land. She thought charm and manipulation would win. She thought rules were for other people. But in the end, she learned the hardest lesson of all, that some battles cannot be won with arrogance, that the truth always comes out, and that when you try to take from someone who refuses to be broken, you don't just lose the fight, you lose everything. And that was a lesson she would never forget.